XLOOKUP is one of those formulas that you learn and you're never looking back. At its core, it's a search function, but it's so great that it will replace things like VLOOKUP, HLOOKUP, index and match, and so forth, and it will save hours of time manually searching data. If you've never used XLOOKUP before, this video is for you, but if you're already an XLOOKUP expert, still stick around because there's two variations of XLOOKUP that people don't talk about that I'm covering in this video, and those two are nested XLOOKUP formulas and XLOOKUP IF. XLOOKUP is one of my favorite formulas in all of Google Sheets, and I'm super excited for you to learn it, so let's dive in. This video does come with a practice sheet, so to make a copy, all you have to do is just click on the link in my description. It will open up this page, just click Make a Copy, and now you'll have an editable version just for yourself. If you want to rename it, you can. So let's go ahead and rename this as XLOOKUP Video, or whatever you want to call it. And now we're good. All right, so there are several different things you can do with XLOOKUP, and at the core, all you're doing is looking up a specific value and returning a value that's correlated with that initial value. The biggest thing to remember with this is if there's multiple values associated with the same ID, it's only going to return the first that it finds. So for example, if I have John Smith down here, John Smith down here, it's only going to return the first John Smith that it sees. There's a couple of ways to kind of combat this, and I'll go over that in a second. But one of the most important parts is you want to make sure you have a unique ID. That way, if there is multiple data, there's a less likely chance of a repeat. So the best thing to do is use an employee ID, a opportunity ID, an account ID, different things like that. But obviously, it will work for generic text as well. All right, so to use XLOOKUP, you'll type equals XLOOKUP. And then here is the different keys that you need. So we have the search key. This is what you're actually searching for within the lookup range. We have our lookup range, and this is the column that you're looking for the search key in. The result range, this is what's returning. And then if you see anything that has parentheses, that means it's an optional value. So these three are mandatory at all times when you're using XLOOKUP. These are optional. So missing value means that if they can't find anything in this lookup range that matches that search key, what do you want it to say? Do you want it to have a reference error, or do you want it to say something specific? Match mode means it's an exact match. So for example, John Smith has to exactly meet John Smith. But then you can also have an approximate match as well. So for example, if I have a 2 here, I can find whether it falls within a range. So 2 to 10, we'll go over that in a second. And then search mode, by default, it goes from the top down, but you can also look from the bottom up. So that way, if you have a date range, for example, and you're trying to find the most recent value, but the most recent is at the very bottom of the list, you can simply put -1 and that will go up there. This will all make sense in a second. All right, so for the search key, typically you're going to simply reference a cell, but you can do text as well. So for example, let's go ahead and put John Smith, and then the lookup range is going to be the range that you want to look up. In this case, we have a roster. So we have a roster tab right here, and I can see all of my associates in this list. So my lookup range is going to be my associates because that's where John Smith is located. And you can reference this a couple of ways. One, you can select the range that you want to do as a whole. And this is roster A2 to A31. And this is perfectly valid. The reason why I don't recommend this is because if you add data later on, it won't be part of the lookup range. Or if you shift down that formula, unless you anchor this in with $signs, you can hit F4 to anchor those in with $signs to make it an absolute reference. This will shift down. So I don't really recommend doing that. It's perfectly valid to do that. But I always simply select the entire column instead just to incorporate everything. My result range is going to be the employee ID. And then as I mentioned before, you only need to have the 3 main parts of the formula to exist. Everything that has parentheses doesn't matter. So I'm going to press enter, and I can see that John Smith has an employee ID of 1000. Let's go back over here to our roster, and we can see, yep, John Smith has an employee ID of 1000. So at its core, that's exactly what the purpose of XLOOKUP is. It's essentially a glorified Control F, but it's dynamic and it returns fixed values instead of having to do Control F every time. All right, so as I mentioned, you're not really going to search a singular value in text form because that's not dynamic, it's not really beneficial. So instead, we're going to search a cell. And as you can see, it matches the same thing, and that's because John Smith is A2, so it's reading the exact same way as if I had text in there. Now, since we're referencing a cell, I can simply drag this formula down, and now I'm able to look up every single one of these values in a matter of seconds, and that's going to match exactly what I see on this list. And best of all, it doesn't matter the order. So right now it's in order as it is on the roster, but that doesn't really matter. All we have to do is simply copy and paste, for example, and it will look up the value no matter what order it is on the list it's looking up from. So that's standard XLOOKUP. You simply put the search key, in this case it's John Smith. You do the lookup range, in this case it's roster and it's the associate. And then you want the return range, in this case it's the employee number. And it's really as easy as that. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and anchor in the A, and I'm going to anchor in the lookup range. That's because the lookup range is always going to exist in column A on the roster and on our search key. So we don't want that to shift whenever we move the formula over. Now, if I drag this formula over to the right, we can see that the start date is now 2/12/2014. And the reason why is because since we had both of these anchored in, the lookup range and the search key both stayed the same. But since this was not anchored in, it's now referencing column C instead of column B. And that's because column C is right after column B. So in order, this is a great way to be able to create a formula once, make it dynamic, drag it over, and now you have all the information that you want. But you can also return multiple values. So instead of having roster B to B, I can go back to our roster and I can select B to D. And now based off of this single formula, it's going to give us all three values. Now this only works if they're in the exact order. So if it's B, D, and E, and there is no C, then it's not going to work the way you want because it's going to return B, C, D, and E. You can always hide it if you want to, but there's other better ways to do this. So as I mentioned, this is all in one formula now. So now if I drag this formula down to the rest of the rows, everything automatically populates just as it would. If you look right here, you can see that we have everything in table form. And this is also the same with roster. So this is actually a table format, meaning that each of these have a named range associated with the column. So for example, if I type in equals roster, this is going to reference the roster table and then whatever column I have associated with it. So I could look up associate, I could look up employee number and things like that. Now, since that's the case, if we go back to our formula, instead of having to go back and forth between different tabs all the time to build formulas, we can simply type in the range. So for our lookup range, for example, I can start typing in roster and I see all the different options in the table. So instead of having to go to the roster tab and select all of column A for associate, I can simply click on this. And as you can see right here, this is the range that it's actually referencing. So now the lookup range is associate. Same thing with the result range. Instead of having to go to roster, I can type in roster and then select the range that I want. I'll put employee number and press enter. Now, this isn't going to let you do it for a range in this case. It's only going to let you do it for the actual column that you're doing. So there's different ways to do things in different manners. One reason why this may be good is so that way, like I said, you don't have to keep going back and forth between columns. And name ranges are automatically fixed, so you don't have to anchor them in with $signs to make them an absolute reference. Now if I drag this formula over, it's going to give me a date from 1902. The reason why it's doing that is because dates are actually numbers on the back end. So if we were to convert this to a number, this would actually be 1000, just like this is. That's obviously not the date that we want. And that's because we're referencing the employee number. And the reason why it's still employee number is because, as I mentioned, table references are fixed, so they're not going to shift like the column does. But it's super easy to fix. All we have to do is type in the new reference. You don't have to type in the table name either. So for example, if I want to put start date, I can simply start typing in whatever the column name is. And now I have all the different tables, all the different options. In this case, I want to have roster start date. So I can click on roster start date, and now I have it. You can do the same thing for the next one. So instead of having start date, I can only delete part of it. And now I can select status. And there we go. All right, so that's table references. But what if there's something that's missing? So for example, if I, instead of Jane Johnson, what if I have Jane Josen? You're going to see an NA, and that's because there is no Jane Josen on my list. Now, instead of having to go, now these NAs honestly look very messy and they're not cute. So let's go ahead and go back to our formula. As you can see right here, it says missing value. So after a comma, you can put whatever you want the missing value to be. So for example, if I don't want to have anything, if I want it to be a blank cell, I can simply put a comma and then leave it blank. And now, if it has an NA, it's going to be blank. But you can also put text. So for example, I can put not found inside of quotes. And now if it has a missing value, it's going to show not found. Reason why it has that error is because I'm in table mode and it's not in a number format, but at the end of the day, that doesn't really matter. But more times than not, I simply put a comma, leave it blank. And that way, if it's a missing value, it's blank. So that way it's not taking up space and clutter, but it's still nice and clean. All right, so as I mentioned, XLOOKUP will start from the very top by default, and it will return the first value that it sees. So even though you only have one result per column at all times, you have the ability to start from the top, or you can start from the bottom. So for example, let's say that we're trying to look up what associate started on February 12th, 2014. We have 3. Now, if I did a standard XLOOKUP formula, we'll type XLOOKUP, select the date, and we'll use this table right here. So I'm going to type in start date, and this will be the XLOOKUP table start date. Then I'll put a comma, and then I'm going to put associate, and this will be the XLOOKUP table associate. And then I'll put a comma, so it's blank if it's missing value, and press enter. So by default, like I said, it starts from the very top, and you can see that the first result that it found was John Smith. But let's say that there's multiple and you want to find the one that's listed last. You can put another comma, and now we're in match mode. We'll get to match mode here in a second, but what we're looking for is search mode. You can actually click on this little caret to expand details to give you more information about the different types of options. And as I mentioned, you can see here that these are all optional. So in search mode, there's a few different options. We have 1, we have -1, 2, -2. So by default, it's 1, and that's search for the first entry to last. And then if you want to search from the last entry to first, you can do -1. So we're simply going to type in -1. And now instead of having John Smith, we have Mark Davis. Now, we don't have the ability to see Jane Johnson, and that's because, like I mentioned, it's above or it's below, but you can't really find things that are in the middle. All right, so that's the XLOOKUP reverse search function. Now, one of my favorite things to do is to create an XLOOKUP inside of an array formula. And if you're familiar with array formulas, that means that you're doing a specific formula to an entire array. An array is just a fancy word for a range. In Excel and in Google Sheets, they both work the same way when it comes to looking up the entire range, returning true or false, and then being able to do formulas based off of what those results are. But in Google Sheets, there's an exclusive ability to do the same formula for an entire range. So, for example, you saw before we had XLOOKUP, XLOOKUP, XLOOKUP for every single one of these employees. But if we turn this XLOOKUP formula into an array formula, we can have one single formula, and that applies that XLOOKUP formula to the entire column. So for example, right here we have this original XLOOKUP formula. So to turn this into an array, you can simply type in array formula, open parentheses, and then you can close it. Now we want to turn this into an array. Right now it's only looking at A2, but we want this to look at the entire column. So I'm going to type in :A. And since this A is linked in with $signs, we're going to go ahead and anchor this in with $signs as well. And once I press enter, you're going to see a value pop up for every single one of these associates, just as if we had an XLOOKUP formula for every single one of these. Now what's great about this is everything is dynamic, so you can drag and drop up and it will still reflect the same XLOOKUP value. If I want to add a missing value, I can make them blank, for example. Now if I don't find somebody, no matter where it is, it will automatically be blank without having to update formulas. And really it's just easier to maintain a few formulas instead of a whole bunch of different formulas. So for example, I can drag this over and then I can update the reference to start date. And then I can drag this formula over. And I can update this reference to status. And now in just a matter of seconds with just these 3 formulas, I have a whole table filled out for everything. So like I mentioned, there's different match types. And by default, it wants to look up an exact match. So let's say I want to look up the number sold, compare it to this range, and return whatever result is correlated with that range. If I were to go the standard route and type in =XLOOKUP, select the search key, select the lookup range, select the result range. I'm going to go ahead and make this an absolute reference by pressing F4. Now you can see we have an NA. If I drag this formula down, we only have one option that actually matches, and that's because we're looking for an exact match. That's not what we want to do because it's not going to give us a lot of results and it's going to be very iffy. And that's because most things fall within a range. So instead, all we're going to do is go back into our original formula. We'll go ahead and make it so it's blank if we have a missing value. And then we're going to put another comma to enter match mode. Now by default, the match mode is equal to 0, which is the exact match. You can also do a positive one or a negative one. So a positive one means that it's the next value that is bigger than the search key. So if I had 45, for example, and my next threshold was 50, then it would return the value correlated with 50. Or negative 1 is the next value that is lower than the search key. So for example, if I had 45 and the next value was 40, then it would return 40. There's also a 2 for a wildcard match. Honestly, I've never actually used that, so I'm not going to touch on that today. But in this case, let's go ahead and put a negative 1. So now if I press enter, I can autofill, and we can see exactly what range this falls in. So right here, we have the range 77. That's between 70 and 100, so it automatically returns good as the result. Now if we're going with the 1, it's rounding up. So instead of 77 being good, it's now amazing because since 77 is above 70, it's now returning 100 and then looking up amazing. Same thing with 66. Instead of it being decent, it's now rounding up to 70 and returning good. So which option you choose will depend on your goal. If you want it to be in this order, then you can do a 1. If you want it to be in this order but be rounded up, you can always do that too. If it's sorted in a different order, then you might want to change it up to be a different match mode. But either way, this is called an approximate match. So it's looking at the value in the table that you're designating. Then it's returning the result that's correlated with whatever threshold you have. All right, so that's XLOOKUP at its core and all of its different functionalities that are built into the XLOOKUP formula. And it's honestly super simple to use once you play around with it a little bit. And you can look up a lot of different information from giant databases, create some pretty complex formulas and different things like that, all dynamically, and it's super, super beneficial. But it can be limiting at times. So I'm going to show you 2 advanced XLOOKUP formulas that don't exist in its natural state that will help you increase your skill set even further. So the first one is a nested XLOOKUP formula. So as you saw, by default, you can either look up things horizontally, you can look up things vertically. I showed you both vertically, but it does work horizontally as well. So for example, for a horizontal lookup, let's go ahead and put XLOOKUP. We'll select this quarter. Then I'm going to look up the range horizontally, and then I'm going to return a different range. I'm going to look up Sarah Wilson, and I can see that Sarah Wilson in Q1 was 16,000, and then it works just the same. So for Q3, 21,000. Now, what if you want to have a vertical lookup and a horizontal lookup? That's where nested XLOOKUP formulas are going to come into play. And like I said, this doesn't exist normally based off of its standard version, but if you get a little bit creative, it does. So we're going to type in equals XLOOKUP. We'll select the associate as the search key, put a comma, and then we'll select the lookup range. I'm just going to select a few and then delete the rows so that way it goes all the way through the end of column B. Put a comma, and now we want the result range. All right, so the result range is where we're going to have to nest another XLOOKUP formula because we don't want to just do Q1, just do Q2, just do Q3, and so forth. So we're going to type in XLOOKUP. We're going to select our quarters, put a comma, select our range. This will be our headers, put a comma, and then now we're going to select the entire database option. So we're going to go C6 all the way through column F. And now once I press enter, we have a hybrid between the two. So if I see William Miller, Q3, William Miller, Q3, 18,000. And we have 18,000 that populates right there. Now let's say we want to have Sarah Wilson for Q1. Sarah Wilson, Q1, 16,000 right there. So it's really cool to be able to kind of look at specific people and look at specific data within that data set. Otherwise, I can get really annoying having to look all the way down, find which column you want to go to, and then find the value. It can simplify things quite a bit, especially if you have giant databases. All right, so that's nested XLOOKUP formula. Now I'm going to show you XLOOKUP IF. Now this does not exist, and I haven't really seen a lot of people talking about it, and that's because I don't think a lot of people know that you can actually do this. But to do this, you do need to know query, which is a version of SQL simplified that's inside of Google Sheets. I do have a video in my advanced playlist. I'm going to link at the very end of this video. So make sure to check that out if you don't know query already. But let me show you. So as I mentioned before, it will either return the first value that it finds from the top or the first value that it finds from the bottom. But what if we want something that's in between? So right here we have this week, we have last week, and we have 2 weeks ago. And we have different companies that were won for each of these options. So we have AtherTech, and AtherTech. So by default, I can very easily, with a standard formula, find the quantity, for example, of the first one, or I could find the quantity of the second one. But if I wanted to find the quantity of the middle one, that's a little bit more difficult. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to type in equals XLOOKUP. The search key will be the company. And then I'll put a comma. The lookup range, I'm going to create a query. So I'm going to put query, open parentheses, select columns A through F, and that's our database. Then inside quotes, I'm going to put select B. And the reason why I'm putting B is because B is the company, where A equals, and I won't get into exactly what this means in this video. You can check out my query video for that, but I'll put a soft quote, quote, ampersand, select H1, anchor that in, ampersand, quote, soft quote. Put another quote to close out the query, and now we have our lookup range. Now, for our return range, it's going to be pretty much the same exact thing. The difference is we're returning a different value. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this entire query, paste that. Instead of selecting B, I'm going to select F, so we're actually going to do the price instead. And then I press enter, and we see 120. Now, 120 for EtherTech is the amount that was sold for 2 weeks ago, and that's because 2 weeks ago was selected. If I were to select last week, this is going to update to 60. Last week, you can see that EtherTech is 60. And then the current week is this week, and that's 217. So now we have an XLOOKUPIF formula, essentially, based off of whatever this upload week is. So this is a great way to be able to get that data in between and make things dynamic. Now you're an expert in XLOOKUP and you're ready to handle anything that comes your way. If you're just starting out and you want to learn more about array formula in query, make sure to check out my playlist here. And as always, don't forget to subscribe. Let me know if you have any questions and like and comment for more.